Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for another installment of What History Teaches: The Rise of Nazism. This series of webinars is held in partnership with the Holocaust Resource Center of Buffalo, Holocaust Museum LA, the Montreal Holocaust Museum, the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center Echoes and Reflections in the Ninth Candle. Thank you to all of our partners for their continuing support of this program. My name is Haley Wells, and I am the program manager at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. Before we begin, I would like to go over a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will be kept on mute for the duration of the program. Today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. Today's presentation comes at a crucial moment in our history when the lessons of the past are desperately needed to combat contemporary iterations of hate, division, and extremism. Our discussion about the role of terror and authoritarian regimes will be presented by Jesse Tanada. Jesse is the Director of Holocaust Content and Pedagogy for Echoes and Reflections. He holds bachelor's degrees in history and Catholic theology from Emmanuel College, as well as a master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Gratz College. Without further ado, over to you, Jesse.
Thank you so much, Haley. I always think of these as 1 hour sprints. So hopefully they'll be fun and engaging, exciting, as well as informative. And we'll take a kind of a deep breath at the end. Um, so happy to be here and to share some knowledge about the role of terror, specifically in Nazi Germany, and how terror and violence are used in authoritarian regimes to consolidate power, to strip opposition, and to punish, dominate their opponents as well as their entire society and mold it to their making, their own being, and what they hope for it to create as a future of whatever their vision might be. And obviously, in Nazi Germany, we're talking about an Aryan nation free of Jews and of any opposition whatsoever. So great to hear so many partners that have come together for this program. Just to give you a little background, if you haven't heard of Echoes and Reflections before, we're a joint program between three world leaders in education and Holocaust history with the Anti-Defamation League, the USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem. Been around since 2005, supporting educators doing webinars like this, as well as other professional development programs, offering lesson plans, resources, and student activities as well, and student-facing resources for the last 20 years, reaching over 175,000 educators. Everything I'm going to show you today is free, open sourced, and online for you to use on our website, and we'll kind of be diving into that as we go along. Much of our work focuses on teachers, so some of the information we'll be talking about a lot today is in an educational space, and I always kind of think of two ways that education is really important to the general public, as well as obviously for teachers and their students. One, that we hope that you gain knowledge, and that knowledge makes you a better teacher, a better person, more informed, better to share these lessons of what your takeaways will be with the general public or with your students, as well as kind of specific things to bring to your classroom. So we'll look at testimonies and some short videos today. We'll have some photographs in there as well that we can use to really talk about, learn about, discuss, analyze about the role of terror in authoritarian regimes. We think about our principles of pedagogy as our North Star. This is really the way that we think about how we build lessons and how we talk about this really difficult history. I want to highlight just a couple. We'll definitely contextualize the history. We won't do too much about anti-Semitism today, although we'll talk about it briefly. I want to make sure that we're fostering empathy, and I want to also just kind of highlight this one as of making the Holocaust relevant. So often, as we've heard in the last year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, of using the Holocaust as a cudgel, as using it as a weapon, as using the history of the Holocaust, distorting it and changing it, and making really hurtful and embarrassing, I would say, comparisons. And yet, we're talking today about the role of terror in Nazi Germany as a way to understand the way that authoritarian regimes function and how those lessons can help us make connections to today and make the Holocaust relevant to ourselves and to our students in a way that is informed, educated, and is not used for clickbait or as a way to denigrate an opponent, but as a way to learn about the cycles of history and the way that we learn about human society. So thinking about this in a really important way. And I want to start um, with this, just kind of getting your opinions for this. Um, I want to fix the chat for a second, so I apologize for that. Um, but we're going to use a website called Menti or Mentimeter. So if you go to menti.com and put in this code, or as well, I'm going to share a link and just want to get a thought, a belief, an idea, what your reaction to the word authoritarianism is, to give us kind of a base knowledge of what we're talking about and how we feel about this word. So right now, sorry for the little snafu, but if you just click on the link and you can open up another browser, I have a QR code on here as well. If you want to just grab your phone and just kind of think about what is a word that you think about when you think about authoritarianism. Perfect. And so the way that word clouds work is that the bigger the word, the more people that have written that. So um, I love this idea of unfreedom as well as we kind of see these dictatorship would be gigantic, right? Infringement on freedom. Um, I really love that idea of unfreedom, right? We have this notion, this belief of what freedom means. And so thinking of the opposite of that, of unfreedom, I'm gonna take that and use that. Ruthless, something about rights, so whether that's no rights or an infringement of our rights. Irrational, which I think is kind of an interesting part, but also one that I might push back on a little bit because as you think about um, ideologies, right? And if you have this firm belief in, um, you know, supremacy, right? So if we're thinking about the Nazis, we're talking about Aryan supremacy, of the supremacy of this race, and you believe in this systemic racism and structure and hierarchy of race, then actually the tactics that the Nazis do fit into their ideology, right? So we might see as irrational or illogical the way that racism is an illogical structure and a human being, made up ideology, idea. And yet the actions of the Nazis are in line with their racial ideology. Control, good one. Yeah, so thank you for that. We're gonna come back to Menti a little bit throughout the presentation to get your ideas. So I really appreciate those. And I want to kind of jump into this idea of rights. And if you're having trouble with Menti or whatever, always great to just grab a piece of paper, just like I have next to me, and jot down notes to kind of help you reflect on what we learn about today. So we have this handout called "What Rights Are Most Important to Me," and one of these is really fun to do with teachers, and then it's really fun to do with students. As you think of some of these different rights, and we ask students to rank them, and you're going to see with this idea of some of them are social, like living in a neighborhood, or go to a public swimming pool, or be able to attend a play or a concert, something like that, right? Those are social aspects of life. Some things are religious or cultural in terms of following kosher, right? Or being able to go to a restaurant that you might like or is part of your culture, right? And others of these are really about security, about protection, about voice and your role in politics and government and society. So this idea about being able to vote, or a really important one about being a citizen of your country, right? We often think of citizenship as one of either we're born with it or we earn it in terms of immigration status, or coming with a visa, or filling out the paperwork and going through this long process to become a citizen. And then what does that mean for you? And one of the ways that I always like to bring this back to is it's a protection not just within your country, but also outside of your country, right? And so as someone who's an American citizen, this gives me great protection, privilege in other countries because of the fact that I'm an American citizen, right? And so there's so many of these rights that are hinged on other aspects, right? And you might see this one say, be able to own a pet, being like, well, yeah, pets are nice, and I have pets, and they're, a great benefit to my life. But, if I wasn't able to, that doesn't seem like the biggest idea, right? Well, bring that to a sixth grader, right? Who's thinking of not this idea of a pet in kind of the ether, but as a person that has, Sparky at home and really cares about them deeply, right? Um, and so kind of thinking about these roles of rights is kind of where I want to sit in terms of how our governments and structures are built, especially within Nazi Germany. So, as we'll kind of talk about after World War I, the Weimar Republic is established as a constitutional democracy. And thinking about the role of constitutional democracies and the rule of law here, about providing fundamental rules and laws, and the idea that the rule of law governs, that democracies create this environment where human rights and the will of the people are respected. And so we can debate about which rights and which liberties ought to be protected and which ones might not be or shouldn't be, depending on your political opinions and ideologies. But in the kind of grandest sense, or in the most kind of broadest sense of your right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? To use those kind of Declaration of Independence values, and the hope of establishing a limit on the power granted to government to prevent it from violating those human rights. And there's always this balance, right? This balance between security and liberty, right? And we see this throughout history, right? If we're thinking of American history, we shift that balance between security and liberty based on the fears of our country and our society, right? So at times people are happy to give up some of their liberties, right, in exchange for security. So, the classic one being airplanes, or in stadiums, that you're okay with being searched, you're okay with, going through the X-ray machines, to having your baggage, to having really strict rules about what you can and can't do in the name of having security. And there's other times, specifically in our country, but also just in our daily lives, that we forego some of those security measures for liberty, right? And so as we think about this kind of function of how democracy fits in the rule of law, I want to kind of bring in the Weimar Republic and what it looks like in Germany. And for that, I kind of want to just go to our website and have you have this ability kind of see how our website functions. And so, as I said, everything that you see today is going to be on our website of echoesandreflections.org. And we're going to spend a lot of time today in our timeline of the Holocaust. So I'm going to just throw those two links in here for you to have and to kind of look through later. But everything's in our website, echoesandreflections.org. If you look at our Teach tab here, we have our timeline of the Holocaust here, along with our units and lesson plans that you can kind of look through later. But in our timeline of the Holocaust, this goes from 1933 to 1945. And we're going to start kind of really early, and we're going to get to kind of the rise as it starts in very early in 1933 here. But I want to kind of bring this informational video that was created by Yad Vashem that really kind of talks about the Weimar Republic and some of the downfalls of it that we haven't got to just quite yet. So let's watch this kind of 2-minute short video about how the Weimar Republic is created and established as this constitutional democracy.
Following World War I, towards the end of 1918, Germany was beaten and humiliated. The Democratic Republic that emerged at the end of the war was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed compensation payments, along with military and political restrictions, while placing the majority of the blame for the war on Germany. Right-wing groups insinuated that the defeat was caused due to internal treachery, and the Republic became identified with national failure and Germany's enemies. The Republic recognized human and civil rights, and, for the first time, Germany's Jews received full equality. Many of them were involved in commerce, and others integrated into society and assimilated into economic, scientific, cultural, and governmental roles. Moreover, Germany experienced significant cultural prosperity in many fields. However, the Republic faced numerous difficulties, which weakened its power. Many of its officials had reservations about the democratic regime and aspired to revert to the old monarchic rule. These years saw several coup attempts and acts, political terror, including the murder of Walter Rathenau, the foreign affairs minister, and Hitler's putsch in 1923. The economic crisis that befell Germany, mainly after 1929, destabilized it and brought on a sense of despair. The Republic eventually met its demise following Hitler's appointment to Chancellor of Germany by President Hindenburg in January of 1933.
And so we have a little bit about the way that this kind of rule of law is built in, and as well as its many instabilities, which we'll get to in a minute. And I think for the sake of time, I might just ask this question in general for you to think about. But I want to ask this kind of question, actually. Let's kind of dive into this. I think it's really important about how democracies protect the rights of its citizens and its inhabitants and what that difference is. And so I can throw the Menti code kind of back in as we dive into this next aspect of it, which is really about the structure that exists within Nazi Germany, within the Weimar Republic, excuse me, and how this is supposed to protect the rights of its citizens. So if we jump back into our Menti here, this asks this question. So let me throw that back into the chat for a second. And ask this next question, which hopefully we can get to here. And so if you want to start kind of filling that out, I'm going to kind of talk through our slide here, which is how the Weimar Republic was set up as this constitutional democracy. And it looks a little confusing because it's a parliamentary government, and it's one that maybe you're not that familiar with, being if you're from the United States, because it's built a little bit differently, more in line with other European constitutions of the time, as well as today. And so you have the voting block here, and in Weimar Germany, the women are given the right to vote before the United States, right? This is 1919, so adult women are given the right to vote, which is a controversial thing at the time, right? And we're going to kind of see a lot of the hopes of forward thinking, and we think about Germany in the 1920s as one of the most progressive, forward-thinking countries on earth at the time. Women are the right to vote. There's dance halls and cabarets and you know, a very outward lifestyle, including LGBTQ plus people are you know, out and about and have places to go in Berlin and in other places. And you see a lot of kind of moving parts here that are built on voting, on the lawmakers, which is the Reichstag, which is the lawmaking body of parliament, what we would call parliament. And then you have these other kind of ministers and chancellors and president that kind of all are appointed, but also have to rely on the support of the people in the way of referendums, as well as in the way of popularity, just because that's how governments function, right, in terms of popularity. And so if we kind of look at some of the responses here about how it, you know, legally through laws, again, equal protection under the law, these checks and balances, right, within the government, but also, again, think about the general public. Again, politicians are held to standards based on their popularity, right? And if you are unpopular, then your policies are not ones that you might want to hitch your wagon to, right? And so it's not just in terms of the legal structure, but also in terms of what the people are thinking, right? The people have a voice. They have, not only do they have a voice in terms of yelling and protesting and that, but they have a legal voice of voting, right? I think there's also diversity here. Throw the bums out. That's a good one. ensures you can participate in society, which I really want to highlight too, is that um, many of these first answers were about the actual laws, which are fundamental to doing it, but it's also telling you about a society that values the will of the people, right? So values the belief in voting, the belief in majority rule, the belief in minority rights. So these kind of central aspects of democracy also tell you a lot about the society in which it functions and the society in which it is in, right? And so what happens, right? We see a little bit in that video about uncertainty, about unrest, about fear. And this is where we really need to contextualize the history of how this democracy was really forced upon Germany. So Germany is young. We think about Germanic culture as being really old, right? Especially if we think about the Austrian Empire that exists for, 1,000 years almost. That the country of Germany as an entity, a political entity, is very, very young. It's been ruled only as a monarchy since 1871. And the Weimar Republic is, by its foundation, already controversial, right? It's formed out of a revolution. It agrees to the Treaty of Versailles, which is, an absolute surrender. It ends the war, and yet there is deep distrust in it already. It's something they've never been governed before by, right? It's kind of forced on them in this revolution. It agrees to this, really harsh treaty to Germany and to Germans, not just in terms of reparations, giving up territory, losing citizens that were part of Germany and now they're not, restricting their ability to raise an army, but is also causing deep shame, right? The having to admit that Germans caused World War One. There's this battle within German culture of we are a great nation, a great people, a great culture. The people that brought you Goethe and Faust and all of this progressive and top of the line scientists and artists and all of this, and yet we're deeply embarrassed and shamed by this treaty, right? And so that becomes a really powerful motivator for many people. And so we have all of this unrest going. There are 9 elections, right? That there's over a dozen political parties. No one is able to really build a coalition to function and be able to govern. And so there's a lot going on. And of course, I'd be remiss to not talk about anti-Semitism as part of this cultural belief system within Germany and within Europe as a whole, right? It's imbued and systemic within European culture, obviously Christianity playing a major role in that. It has a long history of being a scapegoat that we've seen traditionally when instability rises, when there's uncertainty, when there's fear, anti-Semitism historically rises. And that this is a common aspect of Jews have been blamed for misfortunes for thousands of years, right? Whether it's the killing of Jesus, whether it is the Black Plague, whether it's the Spanish flu isn't coming yet, sorry, whether it's cholera or other diseases, whether it's the fall of empires and fall of economic situations, they have a long precedent here of being blamed. And so you take this complex of deep shame, of deep pride of being German, and how could we have lost this war? And you get the stab in the back myth and this kind of readiness to blame a small group, largely unknown, misunderstood by the population. Less than 1% of Germany is Jewish. And so this becomes a unifying rallying cry that we see, throughout these political parties that is not just for Nazism. And so you have political instability and you have political violence. And those are kind of the two things that really show that something's amiss, right? And the Weimar Republic video that we watched talks about the Beer Hall Putsch, an attempt of a coup of, and Hitler and the Nazis are not the only group that has their own kind of militia or paramilitary group. If we strip it of its racial connotations, and we call thugs or hooligans, if you're thinking about not a good analogy, but just thinking of like when fights break out in terms of like British soccer, right? teams. This is happening in the streets. There's violence. Some of it is more organized. Others of it is, rival factions fighting each other, protesters, counter protesters. And this violence really erupts in this one kind of historical moment, which is the beer hall putsch. This is in southeastern Germany. It's where the Nazis have kind of the most support at the time. Violence erupts between Hitler's own paramilitary group, which is the SA. Over 1,000 kind of participate in this, trying to overthrow the Bavarian government in Munich, what we call like their kind of region, what we would call like a state, right? Hitler is eventually arrested. There are many that are convicted of high treason. The sentence is really light, right? He is sentenced to 5 years, serves about 9 months. And, one of the things that we have to be careful with when we talk about history is that we have the benefit of hindsight, right? We have the benefit of seeing this as being a really huge warning sign that this is really bad and like this needs to be handled and that the Nazis have to be pushed out from their extremist views and that they should not be welcome in society. So we think about that with hindsight. But at the time, this is one of, hundreds of political skirmishes that include violence that are tried and convicted of high treason, but yet is not seen as that big of a deal, that the entire country is kind of going through these political violence, and these little different groups and coalitions that are not able to build this functioning democracy, because they're so split. And yet this event also becomes a rallying cry. The history of the event is rewritten as kind of the early steps of our forefathers who set out to unite Germany in this nationalistic spirit, right? And so you can see how that nationalist feeling starts to be another rallying cry, one that is a little bit more palatable as Germany is being fractured, right? Economically, socially, politically, they're a split country. And so the coup fails. Obviously, Hitler, while he's in prison with his personal secretary, he's in a very much relaxed prison, not doing too hard of time, writes Mein Kampf, lays out his, vicious anti-Semitic ideology and belief system that will become the core of Nazi ideology, but in the public, become a little bit more palatable. So the Nazis are gaining popularity. They're up to 40 to 44% in kind of the latest elections of 32 and 33 of being the most popular party in the country. And what are they preaching? Sure, they're preaching the anti-Semitism that is also, bringing in followers and attracting people because, again, that's imbued in society. But they're talking about jobs. They're talking about reclaiming Germany's pride of this nationalistic spirit. They're talking about unifying the country, building new roads, investing in infrastructure and building up, getting people jobs and feeding them, all the things that people are struggling for, that are needed. They're deeply divided, and yet what the Nazis are preaching are, an apocalyptic, this is how we save Germany, with, clear anti-Semitic aspects of it being, essential part of their belief system. But again, Germans are starving. They're out of jobs. They're struggling. They're ashamed to be German. They're fractured. They're looking for this nationalistic savior. And so they get a break with Hitler being appointed chancellor. Germany is deathly afraid of the communists, of the Soviet Union infiltrating of the far left. And so they make a deal to think that they can bring in the Nazis, bring in Hitler as a chancellor to eliminate those communist threats. And they think that they would be able to control him. And so, again, we see this fear of like, what's the fear, pushing people to the right here. And so he's elected, he's appointed chancellor, as you saw, on January 30th, 1933. And then a couple of things happen in the next year that establish an authoritarian regime. And it starts with the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act. So in February of 1933, there's the fire in the government building. We still don't know to this day who said it, but most likely it was the far right of the Nazis who set the fire to use it as a campaign to blame communists, uh, ignite this feeling of fear of that we're going to be taken over like the Soviet Union, and then using that to pass the Enabling Act, which allows the chancellor to bypass the legally elected government in the name of national security, right? So again, that security liberty balance. And I want to kind of answer one of those questions with another kind of informational video of, if we jump back into our timeline, apologies, if I jump back into the timeline, we can see Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Here's the Reichstag fire. And not long after that, we have the Enabling Act, which allows Hitler's government to bypass the Reichstag for 4 years. So again, one of these things that seems like a temporary aspect. And this is where he'll set up a totalitarian regime. And so to answer one of those questions about these differences between authoritarian, totalitarian, dictatorship, I want to show this kind of informational video that kind of breaks down how this is
In the
established.
early 20th century, following World War I, the totalitarian regime began to emerge in Europe, essentially similar to the dictatorship, but with important differences. While dictatorships banned opposition and designated a single ruler, totalitarianism further aspired to permeate all spheres of life of the individual and to fundamentally reshape society. This kind of regime could not exist without modern technology. In many cases, it relied on a wide consensus among the population regarding its ideas and policies. Within Europe, 3 regimes emerged with totalitarian characteristics: Communist USSR, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. These regimes were largely similar. Each instituted an absolute ideology that dictated the way of life, a single powerful party and leader, the use of terror as means of managing the population, and exploitation of state mechanisms and mass media in order to collect intelligence on its citizens and disseminate information to them. Each of these states adopted some totalitarian characteristics, supplementing them with a component emerging from its particular reality and ideology. Communist USSR emphasized class consciousness. Fascist Italy emphasized nationalism, while Nazi Germany emphasized racism and anti-Semitism.
And so as we think about the tactics here of legally, right? So Nazi Germany used, Hitler and the Nazis create a palatable legal mechanism to bring in their ideas to gain popularity, to grow in number. They use a, what I would call most likely staged event to invoke fear, right? And because of that fear, they use legal mechanisms to be able to bypass the government, right? Again, that balance between liberty and security, right? And we see this throughout countries, right? Whether and through our own history, right? That Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War abolishes habeas corpus, right? Suspends habeas corpus is the rule, is the more correct term, right? Because of the war, right? And we see this, throughout history that citizens are willing to give up some of their freedoms in order for security, especially if they're fearful, right? And so as we see the Nazis start to kind of tighten their grip on the country, they're looking to reshape that society, right? And so all of those hopeful things that the Nazis gained, that palatable kind of consensus of bringing in jobs, nationalizing labor, gives people jobs. It also unifies the country. It also points to directly that they are the ones that are fixing society. They bring, back out of the Treaty of Versailles. They start to rebuild the military. That's more jobs. They start to grow armaments and build factories to create weapons. Like those are bringing in more jobs. And so as the individuals, I always like to ask, we don't ask, why didn't people stand up to the Nazis? Because they did in many, many levels. But better question to ask is, what did the average German gain from supporting the Nazis, right? Well, they got a job, they had a roof over their head. Jews started being kicked out of professions, of being lawyers, of being doctors, of working in the civil servants. And so all of a sudden now you're getting promotions and you might not like the most racist of the policies, but your life is benefiting. And so there's a lot that you ignore. And so those that don't, the parts that you don't ignore is where this extra part comes from, right? So we just saw kind of the legal erosion of rights in the name of security, in the name of, passing a law that gives the Nazis the ability to bypass the laws for the name of security. And so then how do you get consensus? How do you continue to grow in popularity enough that people don't revolt? Right. And so this is where we get the role of terror most kind of in the consolidation of power. And the biggest part or the biggest way that you see this is in extra legal punishment. You'll see that in the role of concentration camps and how concentration camps started as extra legal jurisdiction against voices of opposition. And so I want, again, I think these short little videos are so helpful. And so I want to, as we just saw, we have Chancellor of Germany, you have the Reichstag fire, right? You have the Enabling Act, and you also have the establishment of the concentration camp system, the first one being Dachau, and what its role is in society. So I do want to show this video. It does get towards the end where the war is going on, but I really want to focus on the beginning part of what this role of concentration camps really did to the society in general. The German society, for German citizens especially.
The first concentration camps were constructed in Germany in 1933. They were primarily used to solidify the regime by using political terror and incarcerating those perceived as dissidents. The working model for these camps was Dachau. After the consolidation of the regime, those perceived as a threat to the Nazi vision, such as asocials, were also sent to the camps. At this stage, especially following the Kristallnacht in 1938, the number of Jewish prisoners in the camps rose significantly, the majority of whom were exploited for economic purposes, many as forced labor. Due to the significant rise in prisoner count and the need to exploit the conquered territories, including their manpower, the Germans began constructing many more labor camps, some solely for Jews. During this period, prisoners of war camps and other concentration camps were constructed as well. The number of concentration camps constructed in Germany and throughout Europe continued to increase. From this point on, the concentration and labor camps were used for massive and brutal exploitation of prisoner labor and for implementing the policy of mass murder of Jews. For this purpose, 6 extermination camps were constructed and converted from existing camps. Some of them were concentration and extermination camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek, and some were exclusively extermination camps, such as Chelmno and Treblinka. In total, tens of thousands of different kinds of camps were constructed, in which millions of people were murdered or died.
And so I know that this video gets to some of the later times of the war, but the kind of these parts about they were initially constructed for people that spoke out against the regime, particularly communists. Again, think about that fear of communism. And then this category called asocials, which was basically anyone that the Nazis thought were not working towards the Führer, as they called it, or functioning in the society in which they were built, hoping to reset and create and reshape, right? So this included people that, they called work shy, so people that were lazy or people that didn't have jobs. Obviously, they also included prostitutes. It included people who were alcoholics, who were homeless, basically just became a category to lump in anyone that they didn't agree with, right? So again, another aspect of this is that they're not breaking actual laws. They're either, and they're not even necessarily speaking out against the regime. They're just anyone that kind of doesn't fit the Nazi view of what German society should be, which is a fungible, moldable, broad term that could mean anyone, right? So another one of these aspects of how to use terror is that this isn't only attacking people with opposing views. This isn't only attacking people that speak out against the government. It's attacking anyone that doesn't fit the profile that someone might think should be a Nazi, right? Which could literally just be anyone, right? So again, this idea of terror is not just outside of the judicial system, but is also something that could make you a target, right? And invoke that fear to just go along, right? To fit in. And I want to, a really important aspect of understanding this history is using testimony. So I want to introduce Herbert Kahn here, who was born February 11th, 1921, in Gmunden, Germany. He had three brothers, one sister, other than his brother Arthur, which he's going to tell the story of. The rest of his family is able to escape to the UK, and then into the United States. He actually serves in the U.S. Army. But he's going to tell you about these kind of early times of Dachau and what it was like for his brother. And so another way that, as we hear from Herbert, that this terror regime is used to consolidate power, I think is really illustrative in they sent something called the Gestapo after him. We didn't know what that was. He was sent to Dachau. We didn't know what that was. And then we get the detail that he was shot while trying to escape. And so not only is there this terror of like, what law did he break? Was there a trial? Why wasn't these, the things that we talked about in terms of how a democracy protects the rights of its citizens? You also are being given words that you don't know what they mean, right? You don't know what the Gestapo is. You don't know what Dachau is. And you only had that he was shot while trying to escape. And so that also invokes a lot of fear, right? One, that he's killed, right? It was very sad and a tragedy, but also that why was he trying to escape, right? That's not in the kind of lexicon of normal, process for a democracy or even for anything that establishes a law, right? You're arrested, you go to jail, you await trial, you're arraigned, right? There's a sequence and a process. And so to have none of that process and to be given these words that you didn't know what they were invokes more fear, uncertainty, right? Unrest. And you're seeing there's less violence in the street, but it's targeted, right? That people that you run into are saying, oh, what happened? Like, oh, they were sent to this place. I don't know what that is. And then they said he was shot, right? So there's a lot of rumors flying. And so that kind of fear brings people in line, right? And so this aspect of extra legal punishment is essential to invoke fear, to force compliance, and to get rid of any kind of dissent, right? And so, my apologies. I think that the biggest part of that comes in what we call the Night of the Long Knives, which is June 30th, 1934. So much is going on in this first 2 years, right? And it's really about the establishment, consolidation of power, and the ruthless kind of takeover of society. And so we take a an event like the Reichstag fire. We're able to legally uh, circumvent the laws by saying, for national security, we're under attack. The communists are coming for our laws. So we are able to bypass the laws. The Nazis are able to bypass the laws in the name of national security, right? And then we have extra legal punishments. We have this fear. We have, uh, there are still groups going around. The SA, as we're going to talk about in a minute, the SS has also been established and not really sure what its function is. We also have the Gestapo, which is kind of the secret police that has also been established. And then we also have the regular police forces, right? And we have all of the other kind of groups that are supporting the Nazis or are benefiting so far from these policies without kind of having to deal with or face or confront the anti-Semitic and racist parts of their ideology. And so the Night of the Long Knives is kind of the last kind of step in the consolidation of power. And so, as we talked about the Beer Hall Putsch about 10 years before this, is the SA, which is this militia, this what they call brown shirts because they wore brown shirts, of this kind of Hitler's, public-private militia that would go and beat people up, cause violence, never get in trouble, kind of that mob rule. And they're also been there since the beginning, right? And so we have that myth making of the Beer Hall Putsch and the valiant SA that have been here from the beginning. They're the true believers, and some powerful people, as we see on the left here, is Ernest von Röhm, the leader of the SA. And so the Night of the Long Knives is the elimination of the internal challenge of the Nazis. So, first it's communists and the left and getting rid of opposing voices, and then it's consolidating power by getting rid of any rivals and elevating those that are loyal and are willing to do anything for Hitler, right? Which is where you see Heinrich Himmler on the right, who will become the leader of the SS and really the driving force behind the Holocaust and behind the concentration camp system, and be the number 3 behind Hermann Goering, right? And so this Night of the Long Knives is the elimination of any type of rival. And so we get the elimination of political rivals, then we get the elimination within our own party to get rid of anyone who may challenge our rule. And now we're left with Hitler, and the only people left are those that have pledged absolute loyalty and know, again, this fear and terror that if they step out of line, they'll also be eliminated, right? And so this is a tactic that is not just about getting rid of people that might challenge you. It's also sending a message of those that step out of line will also be eliminated, right? And there are no repercussions for any of this, right? This is official state policy. And so there's also that kind of great fear that, seeps into every aspect of, well, we can't say anything, we can't oppose the ruler because we know what happens, right? As we see with the murder of Ernst von Roth, and many of the leaders of the SA are killed in this night. And so as we're getting to kind of the last 10 minutes, I did have a great testimony that we'll have to skip, but basically a man tells of someone in the SA lived in his apartment building, and in the middle of the night, he knock on the door. It was the Gestapo, shot him twice and left, and then didn't realize that he was the wrong Mr. Schmidt, that the Mr. Schmidt that was in the essay was living on the floor above. Just to kind of give you that sense of violence was a norm, was accepted, and was part of the society that was being reshaped under Nazi ideals. And so, as we kind of seek to the end and have a few minutes for a few questions, I wanted to offer this pyramid of hate, which is a really great teaching tool and one that we use pretty frequently. And kind of as you reflect on the rest of this webinar today of, these biased attitudes and acts of bias that form the foundation to allow the parts of the higher levels of the pyramid of hate. So whether that's the discrimination that are kind of official government policies or violence, the reason that much of this violence is allowed is because that it is generally accepted by the population. And if they're, that doesn't mean that everyone agrees that you should be going around and murdering people, but it probably means that, well, they were communists, or, well, they deserved it. They lit our government building, or, yeah, like he was dangerous, or, oh, I benefited from this because my Jewish boss was fired and I got a promotion and now my family is living better and be able to go on vacation, right? So even if that isn't necessarily part of their, the ruthlessness that comes from the top, there are these biased attitudes and acts of bias that allow for these upper echelon and more violent tactics to happen and be approved. And so I want to highlight and just give one last part of focusing on the victim here. We spent a lot of time on today about the actions of the Nazis, of Hitler and the establishment of terror, and how authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes create the necessary kind of environment that they utilize public's fear and distrust and uncertainty. They will utilize the population's biases and hatreds and anti-Semitism to establish power. They'll also use the legal routes that are available to them. Then they'll use terror to consolidate that power. And so all of that is really about power and power dynamics. But I want to make sure that we also think about and really focus on the victims of this story and what that part of society and how society is reshaped to get rid of, to exclude, to isolate, and to denigrate and dehumanize the victim group. And so I want to end with Henry Laurent's testimony here. And to kind of take the intellectual part that we've talked about today and bring in that emotional. So Henry was born May 28th, 1924 in Königsberg, Germany. His father served in World War I as a veteran and became a therapist. They eventually moved to Berlin. After Kristallnacht, he is saved by the Kindertransport. Henry goes to live in England in a group home and then working on agricultural fields during the war. And eventually marries an American woman and immigrates to the United States. He's the only survivor in his family. His parents and his sister are murdered in the Holocaust. So just want to talk about or think about the emotional impact of the intellectual stuff that we talked about with Henry's testimony.
For Whitsuntide, for Pfingsten, as it's called, this was a popular holiday, same as Easter, and people it was a national holiday. And Pfingsten, usually what you did, you went out into the countryside and you came back with green branches. It was a kind of a spring holiday, beginning of summer, and it was in May. And you came back and you decorated your house or your apartment with these branches. So we had been out in the car, and we came back, and we had this open car that you've seen on the convertible that you'd seen on the photo, and we drew up in front of our house, let us out, and then my father would drive into the garage after we'd got out. My mother and sister and I got out, and I wasn't looking at the house. I was looking at something else on this side. There was the house. I saw my father. My father's face turned to stone. And he was looking at the house. I looked at the house, and as I mentioned before, his practice was in the apartment. So there was his professional sign, copper or whatever they have, as a doctor, was right fixed in front of the door, by the side of the door. And across the entire door, the entire, of course, the sign itself, and the whole front of the house, splattered with this Jude and various other slogans, Jude raus, and all kinds of really nasty things. And I mean, this was, I will never forget my father's face when he saw that. This must have been like a dagger in his heart. And he must have intellectually, as I said, he was an exceptionally intelligent man. He must have intellectually known something like that was coming. It was inevitable. Even the most assimilated would be at some point hit with this. How far it would go, of course, nobody knew at that time. But this was the first time it really came home to him. It was his sign, his name, besmirched.
So as we kind of wrap up, I just wanted to use Henry's testimony as this this connection of the intellectual, of understanding the society, and being able to look at the way that authoritarianism works, and how terror is used to establish power in the Nazi regime, but also to focus on the victim part. And so to have that intellectual ideas that we really spent a lot of time with about how this society can really fall into and devolve into what it became. But that Henry's testimony of like, my father is very intelligent, I'm sure he could have seen this coming intellectually, and that there's such a difference between that and the personal emotion of being attacked, I think is really important. Just checking if there's any other questions. I feel like I did answer a lot of these, so I appreciate them. I guess there are some questions. I have about a minute left, so I think there are a lot of questions about looking for similarities or trying to make connections of what's going on in the world today with what happened then. And I think that one thing is like really important to make connections and to learn about the way that authoritarian regimes work. So things that like using terror, using extra legal punishments, denying facts, and building and trying to reshape a country based on whatever your ideology is, I think is a dangerous one, and one I think that we see in many countries, right? Whether that's some similarities, you can make connection to the world, to the United States, or to what's going on in Hungary under Orban, or in Belarus, or what we're seeing in Iran. So a lot of things that we can make connections to, but I think also really important to understand the contextualization of the history and like what's going on, what specifically was going on in Nazi Germany and in the Weimar Republic that made this happen, and that it wasn't inevitable, and that there were many times that things could have been done, that people could have made a different choice, or could have recognized the dangers and not let fear dictate what they were willing to stomach. As well as, I guess my last point before I throw it over to Haley to close us out, is about the not letting fear kind of dictate what you're willing to stomach. And I think that people are very often selfish. If you have a roof over your head and a job and can feed your family, that you're willing to ignore kind of many of the most detestable aspects of a governmental policy or aspect. And so I think that you shouldn't ignore those parts of the ideology, because they are very often the engine, as we see in Nazi Germany and under the Nazis, that anti-Semitism was a core part of their ideology and not just a fringe belief, that it was central to their worldview. So I want to thank everybody. I loved your responses, really appreciated it, appreciated the questions that I saw throughout that I hope I answered in the presentation, and always willing to help out in any way that I can. So thanks, especially to you, Haley, and to the Alabama Holocaust and Education Center. Has been a great partner, and is a great partner, and for all of those other organizations that we get to interact with all the time. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Jesse. This was great. Thank you for the conversation and the presentation, and especially all the resources you shared. They are really, really wonderful. So I encourage everyone in the minute that I'm talking, if you've not clicked those links yet, to click them, so you have them to look through later. But to let y'all know briefly, the next installment of What History Teaches will take place on Wednesday, March 11th at 11 a.m. Central Time again. And in this session, Lauren Crampton from the Holocaust Education Research Council will speak about art as a form of resistance during the Nazi regime. So she's going to focus on the German Expressionist artists and how they spoke to convey emotional truth and social truths through abstraction, distortion, and bold color, and how their artwork often came into conflict with the Nazi regime's cultural ideology. And as the regime condemned Expressionist work as degenerate art, many artists faced censorship, exile, and persecution. So she will talk about that, as well as the way that their art continues to remain a visual act of defiance. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this program. For all our events, we get our best traction by word of mouth, so we would greatly appreciate you sharing the recording and the schedule of programs with friends and colleagues. Share the Echoes and Reflections resources as well. They're a great educational resource for people who are hoping to learn more. And thank you for joining us all this afternoon, and we can't wait to see you at our next program. Have a great afternoon, everyone.